Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of Advanced Stats with Scott Spratt. I'm your host, Scott Spratt, a writer for FTN Fantasy, and I have more than a decade of experience doing advanced statistical research and working and writing for companies like Football Outsiders, ESPN, Pro Football Focus, Fangraphs, and Sports Info Solutions. I've worked with industry titans like Bill James and Aaron Schatz, and I'm going to try to help you take that knowledge and apply it to good fantasy football decisions on this show. During the season, that's going to be waiver wire advice. It's going to be game previews where I help you make lineup decisions in both traditional and DFS formats. And right now it's August the 26th, so I'm going to try to help you make good fantasy football draft decisions this weekend. It's the third preseason week of games. And to help me out on the episode, I'm bringing in a new FTN colleague for me, and that's Vlad Sedler. Let's bring in Vlad. Okay, I'm joined by Vlad Sedler, my new colleague at FTN and someone that I respect immensely for still doing both baseball and football coverage. Vlad, I'm too old for that anymore. I don't know how you keep all the names straight at this point.
Yeah, it gets a little wild, especially around this time here at the end of August, beginning of September. Going to be a lot of double duty, but got to be able to handle both, and so I'm pretty happy to do so.
I'm very impressed. But for the purposes of today's show, let's stick to fantasy football, which coincidentally, you just updated your PPR rankings earlier this week. So did I. So I thought you would be a really good guest to go through and look for some of the bigger differences as people head into a lot of fantasy drafts this weekend and then in Labor Day weekend as well. So I figured let's hit on the biggest disagreements we have and try to come up with, maybe we can convince each other, come up with some agreements if we can, going position by position, picking the players that we disagreed the most. I figured that whichever of us has the more aggressive ranking, we can try to talk each other into that player. So starting with quarterbacks and with Aaron Rodgers, I have him ranked 11th among quarterbacks. You have him 15th. So let me try to pitch you on this. 3-4 years ago, people were like, I don't know, maybe Aaron Rodgers is kind of past his prime. It's not really going well. And in those seasons, he threw just 5 and 7 touchdowns within 5 yards of the end zone. Meanwhile, the last 2 seasons, he threw 20 and 13 touchdowns within 5 yards of the end zone. Almost double the rate, basically. And you can say that, hey, like he was getting into the red zone more, that sort of thing. But honestly, I think this was almost more of a choice than anything else. He wanted to take those easy to grab inside close touchdowns to bolster MVP cases, which he ended up winning. So suddenly people aren't too upset about it and saying that he's washed up or anything like that. So it's an effective strategy from a PR perspective. And I can't see why that's going to change, even though he lost Davante Adams. What say you?
I mean, I don't think, as far as our rankings go, and we basically both have them in the 10 to 15 range, of course, you a little bit on the higher end, almost in that QB1 zone, in the 1 through 12 zone there. But I really don't have them all that far out. I don't think I disagree with you all that much. I do have we don't like to have special connections necessarily in redraft. We want to be able to separate the pass and not be like, oh, I love this guy or this person killed me. Every new season, it's a new scenario. I'm thinking back to, I guess when I was a pretty hefty sports bettor in 2010, I ended up betting in the playoffs the over and it basically parlayed the over with the Packers in 4 straight weeks and ended up just, that was obviously his big year.
Yeah.
So smash those 4 weeks. But a lot has happened obviously since then. As far as this season goes, I think one of the most impressive parts, rarely talked about in fantasy analysis, specific to him, and it does make a difference on the point side, is the guy just doesn't throw picks. He's basically averaging under 4 interceptions per season over the past 4 years, and usually kind of right between, at least recently over the last 4 years, between 4,000, 4,400 passing yards over the last 4 years. TD, touchdowns over his last 5 healthy seasons. We obviously saw the 40 that he threw in 2016, played half a season in 2017, and then basically a couple of down years there where he threw 25 and 26, and then 48 and 37 over the last couple of years. One of those years, of course, the 2020 when he had that kind of that clear outlier season where he was the QB1. So very legitimate concerns, I think, with the loss of Davante Adams, who he really had this uncanny connection with. Losing Davante, the Yak Monster, and no Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who was obviously quite a field stretcher, obviously drops of passes. So
True.
Lots of question marks with this core here with Lazard, the purported wide receiver 1, old man Randall Cobb, a couple of rookies. And then obviously we think Aaron Jones will be more involved in the passing game. I think he averaged 64 targets and 48 receptions over the last 2 years. I mean, would we at all be surprised if he's between 80, 90 targets with 70 receptions? I think it's all in the cards. I'm not really down on him all that much. I think I'm kind of in the ballpark with you. It's really just a matter of some of the other guys in that range. And then also, of course, where I'm drafting a lot of times in NFFC, he's always ending up a bargain. So he's falling. So this is a scoring system with 6 points per passing touchdown. And he's going like 140, 160 overall. You're talking about 12th, 13th round. As a QB2, that's a phenomenal value. And I would take that all day.
So it sounds like there's a little bit of kind of market wisdom in your lower ranking here relative to
Mm-hmm.
mine, where it's like you can actually wait and get Rodgers maybe
Mm-hmm.
in that 13, 14, 15 range, which honestly, that makes a lot of sense. I know there's a lot of aggressive bets on players like Trey Lance, which I know is another player that you're a big fan of, but I would be happy to wait on Rodgers, especially in your shallower leagues. Let's jump to a quarterback that we're a little bit further apart on in the other way, Tua Tagovailoa. I'm down at 21 for him, but you have him up at 16, somebody that you maybe would want to consider as a second quarterback in your shallower leagues. What's your pitch for Tua? You think he's going to have a big year?
I hope so. I mean, we haven't really seen that full healthy season. He really hasn't had it. And it wouldn't be shocking at all to expect him to set career highs really across the board, primed for a solid season at least, having these amazing new additions. I think with Tyreek Hill, Chase Edmonds as a pass catcher. I actually don't even mind Cedric Wilson. We saw him stand out in a few games.
He's great.
Yeah, with the Cowboys last year. And he goes a little past that Carr, Rodgers, Cousins range. For me, I feel like if he ends up as my QB1, I would. It's kind of a failed draft. I usually want to get a better quarterback, really, no matter the format, because there is a little bit of risk with him. But last season, made only 11 full starts. In those games, he only had one outing with over 300 passing yards. Only one of those starts with over 2 touchdown passes. I think we'll see quite a few more of those ceiling performances. But as for this season, I have him probably somewhere around 4,300 yards, maybe 27 to 30 touchdowns, 11, 13 interceptions. And then he had those rushing scores, the 3 of them last year. And I think because he's kind of in that tight bunch in the 12 to 20 group among quarterbacks, I think that might be the difference maker there, right? I mean, if he can run 5 or 6 in, which I guess is within the realm of possibility, you're looking at potentially a borderline QB1. Whereas if he doesn't get in the end zone on it with his legs, he may fall outside of that. So we'll see. But I am bullish on him because of the new weapons there.
I mean, I think it really makes sense, especially from the rushing touchdowns perspective. You getting Tyreek Hill and stuff. A lot of that makes sense. And I've long been a fan of Tua. I feel like he gets unreasonably dogged by analysts. He's actually been a fairly effective passer in his career. He was basically neutral by passing DVOA last season. So I'm not so much concerned about Tua, the player or the passer, and think that the offense could be really good for him. The problem is I'm just not sure it's the most fantasy-friendly offense unless you're right that he ends up running in a lot of these touchdowns. And it's just really a volume game. Like the Shanahan system is one that tends to promote its running backs, and it relies on speedy running backs that often score from longer away from the end zone and kind of cuts into the passing touchdown work. And if you just look at the passing totals last year of the 49ers, I think it's a pretty great example. So Jimmy G threw 418 pass attempts in his 14 full games. That's 29.9 per game. Tua threw 33.7 per game last year. So almost 4 more than I would say I would expect from Tua this season. And while the efficiency is likely to improve, I mean, Garoppolo was basically the most efficient quarterback in football last season, but that didn't translate into a tremendous fantasy season. I think Tua is going to probably have to score, like you said, that like 30 plus touchdown range to kind of get into that upper tier. And I'm just not sure it's going to happen. I think the Dolphins offense may be very good. I'm just not sure it's going to translate into total fantasy success. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right there. You know what would be really fun is if we just saw a bunch of plays designed short passes to Tyreek or Edmonds or even Mostert and just take those suckers to the house, right? You get a bunch of those during the season. That'd be much better than just kind of handing it off and having those guys run them in.
We need those swing passes to be just a little bit in front of the line of scrimmage as opposed to a little bit behind. Okay, Vlad, let's shift over to running backs where we have another set of good disagreements. Some of these that are pretty fantasy important, I think, towards the top of drafts, starting with Najee Harris, who I have 5th and you have down at 10th. So pretty big difference there. Let me take the bullish case of him here. I think a lot of this just kind of comes down to the volume that we saw last year where he was 7th and 5th among running backs in carries and targets. a lot of that is about health, and he had a fully healthy season last year. But I think the Steelers have proven in the Tomlin era to rely on featured backs. The team doesn't really have a ton of depth at the position. I think they're probably relying on an undrafted rookie as their second running back this season. So you feel like Harris is probably going to continue to get that work. And I'm eyeing maybe a potential increase in his efficiency. So like 3.9 yards per attempt last year, not good. 4.2 is the league average. So he was one of the least effective backs in the league in that sense. However, he had a 15% broken tackle rate. That was 11th among running backs with 100 or more carries. To me, his inefficiency was a lot more about his surrounding talent and circumstances than it was his own abilities. And I'd say most notably is that the Steelers had a 67% run block win rate, was third worst in the league. Roethlisberger didn't help either. But I'm wondering if it's clear that the Steelers haven't made major upgrades on the offensive line or at quarterback, but really it's hard to get much worse. So if guys like James Daniels can come in and make a difference, I feel like Harris can kind of bump up and have a very effective fantasy season. Are you more pessimistic or like what's your thought on the Harris front?
I am. I think this is one of my stronger takes, and I don't have a lot of exposure to Najee Harris, and have been drafting a lot over on NFFC and on Underdog. But for me, it just comes down to the guys in his range, basically running backs that I just simply prefer to take a shot on. And this is also because I am playing. It is a little tilted to the type of competitions that I'm in that have a large overall component where I'm looking for the extreme upside for a guy that I think can potentially finish as a top three, not only at their position, but overall. And that's my issue with Najee. I don't know if he can get there. And it really has something to do with him because I think he's immensely talented. And, it might be kind of the vanilla take of the century, but I just can't get behind a running back on a bad offense. So I think he'll be trailing a lot. Now, obviously, some question marks with quarterback Baker Mayfield. You made a good point about really, how much of a drop off is that from Ben Roethlisberger. But, obviously, the lack of depth in the wide receiver corps behind Deontay Johnson, a not so great offensive line, slightly improving, but I still think it's one of the worst in the league. And then last year, he was the PPR RB3 on points alone. I'm just not certain how that'll happen again this year. Efficiency, you mentioned it, a little bit of a concern, 3.9 yards per clip last season. And he was second in rushing attempts, but one of only two guys with 300 plus. I'm not sure he sees 300 necessarily again. I know there was a quote recently by running back coach Eddie Faulkner, who essentially indicated that Harris would probably play about 7 fewer snaps per game this season. I don't know, saying that isn't really going to impact his targets and touches as much. But, even if he does get it 4 yards per clip, 260, 280 yards, I don't necessarily see a repeat on those total yards. I believe it was 1,200 on the dot. And then third is just the receiving aspect of it, where I feel like his numbers were a bit inflated by a single outlier game. It was that week 3 outing where he caught 14.
16 targets, right?
Yeah, it was insane. Yeah, and he had never seen, and after that game, he basically never saw more than 7 targets or caught more than 6 balls, and that was the game Juju got hurt. Deontay Johnson didn't play. So, I have him maybe, he averaged 17 PPR points per game last season. I think he probably drops to 14, 15. I think he's a solid second rounder. But here's the real issue. And I know it's sometimes a concern where we don't want to over assess how opposing defenses might be year to year because it's not very sticky and those things change. Mm-hmm. But I really kind of took a deep dive into the schedule, and I'm looking at, okay, at Cincinnati to start, the Patriots, the Browns, the Jets, the Bills, Bucks, Miami, and Philly. And that's his start before the bye week. So he's going to have to kind of get involved in the passing game, catch a lot of passes, because I don't really see them having a lead in a lot of those games, maybe outside of the Jets or Browns or whatever. But other than that, I don't know if he's going to get there with the rushing attempts and then be efficient with them. So those are kind of my 3 main concerns.
All very fair. And I think it probably explains at least half of why you have Saquon Barkley higher. You have him up at 5th, and I'm way down at 16th. So I think I have some major concerns there with Barkley. I'd like to hear your pro argument first, having him well ahead of even Najee Harris.
Yeah, I really just think I'm mostly interested in how he's looking and how healthy he is now, because I do think it's been quite a while now since the injury and all that, and still 25 years old, I believe. And it's just a whole new outlook here. I think the Giants are somewhat cursed, kind of have that, that crossover from the New York Mets. But there is a new offense in town. There's a new coach, Brian Dable, with a great track record. one who has been quoted as saying he wants to pepper Barkley heavily with targets. They'll probably bring in a veteran backup. I think Matt Breida is a little brittle, but I see a really heavy workload for Barkley this season. And I'm talking like 110 plus targets, maybe 80 plus catches. The offensive line's a little improved, but still maybe league average. So I don't know if I necessarily expect those, the 4.8, 4.9 yards per carry like he had in the first 2 seasons. But even if you're talking like 4.5 per clip with like 240, 250 carries, you're looking at somewhere between 1,100, 1,300 rushing yards. And then that rookie season, man, he was so dynamic. I know it's many years removed from that, but 7 games of 100 plus yards. He had 7 carries of 40 plus yards. I mean, obviously not numbers we can predict, but just something we can sprinkle in. Projected schedule looks okay. They'll face some tough opponents in the first half, but they'll also see Jacksonville, Seattle, the Bears, the Panthers, and he'll be used as a pass catcher. I like a lot. The wide receiver group is already banged up, and maybe a lot of negative game script here. So I would not be shocked. I wouldn't predict him to be the RB1 overall, but I wouldn't at all be shocked to see him get there. So for me, like a mid to late first round pick, I'm usually pretty happy with that. But then again, I'm also the type that does embrace risk, I think, a little bit more than most. So if it was my only draft, I don't know if I would take him in the middle of the first round, my home league, for example. But in these online overall competitions, I really do like Barkley.
Yeah, that's bold. I think it's great. And I think if he does get 80 catches, then you're going to be 100% right. Like, to me, that's more the line of thinking I had with Harris getting that type of passing volume. But clearly, at least earlier in his career, Barkley had that kind of versatility. And I'd love to see it again. And I think injuries probably had a lot to do with this. But the point that I'm going to bring up is that the efficiency has been in a huge nosedive in his career. So in 2018, you mentioned how incredible he was as a rookie. 21.5% broken tackle rate, just exceptional. I think it was either first or second in the league among heavily used guys. 2019, before the injury, it was down to 18.4%, still very good, but not the like clear outlier type of rate there. He injures the ACL, misses 2020, and then coming back in 2021, 9.9% broken tackle rate. That was 7th lowest among backs with 100 or more carries. The ACL isn't usually a 2-year injury the same way the Achilles is. So I'm just wondering, is it possible that he's not the same player that he was 2 years ago? That's the major concern that I have. And I feel like at least Harris hasn't been hurt yet. That's to me like a big difference there in my mind.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, this is a very interesting group, a very interesting range where people can just kind of it's who do you prefer, right? I mean, all the guys at the end of the first round, early second. You mentioned Najee Harris. We talked about Barkley, Dalvin Cook, DeAndre Swift, Joe Mixon, Derrick Henry. It's a fantastic range. And just on a side note, it's one of the reasons why I really don't mind drafting from the back end of the first round and being able to grab a couple of those guys.
With you there. And I think I'm kind of giving away how cowardly of a drafter I really am, because the next back to discuss is David Montgomery. I have him 13th. I have him ahead of Saquon Barkley, even in my own rankings, whereas you have him down at 22nd. So like chasms of rounds apart in your mind. And I feel like you probably have the more standard opinion here, but I guess I don't really totally understand why Montgomery isn't thought of as being a better back than he is. And to me, I kind of set this up as a whole Montgomery versus his backfield teammate, Khalil Herbert, because I think Herbert came in and had some success when Montgomery missed a handful of games last season. And I think people can kind of see that transition potentially happening with Montgomery becoming a free agent after this season. But I'll say if you just look at it last year, the fantasy-friendly work went to Montgomery. Overall, their carries were split 225 to 103. So, a little bit more than 2-1, but carries within 5 yards of the end zone. Montgomery outdid him 14-3. It's pretty big. Montgomery's 12 pounds heavier. So I think he's going to continue to get that goal line action. And then catches wise, 42-14, a huge advantage. And I feel like Montgomery's always been a fairly efficient receiver. A couple of years ago when Tariq Cohen was involved, he didn't really get as much of that work, but the last couple of years, he's gotten a ton of work as a receiver. So I see him as being effectively a 3-down back, even if he's splitting time in a sense as well. So what has you relatively pessimistic for Montgomery compared to me?
Again, I think part of it has to do with the type of contest that I'm playing in. But I think he gets a bad rap also because of just public perception and Twitter, because going back to the meme of hands like David Montgomery or, speed like David. So he catches a lot of flack. Talent wise, I think he's okay. He's solid. He's like a bowling ball, right? You just
Yeah.
even last year, I look back, I was shocked to see he had only scored 5 touchdowns because I could have sworn he at least had double that. But he does kind of have the people have the perception of him as like a plotter and an accumulator because he did have the low yards per carry last year under 4. And I don't necessarily want to call him a poor man's Najee Harris because I do think Najee is a lot more talented. I think higher draft capital as well. And I could see him catching 50 balls again, but maybe struggling to eclipse 1,000 rushing yards. And again, also, I would be shocked to see him score double-digit touchdowns. So 5 last year, 7 the previous year, where I think a couple of those were receiving touchdowns. And I do think Khalil Herbert, I don't know if we have enough of a sample size, but I don't know if there's that much of a talent gap between him and Montgomery. I do see him starting to get a little bit more work, and they have Ebner and some other people there. So I'm not opposed to Montgomery. He just kind of fits that, sort of boring, steady guy in those middle rounds. But what it really comes down to for me is roster construction. I'm usually not hitting on running backs in his range. So usually there's just like this immense group of talented, like 20 receivers, where half of them I like
talking
very
about the
much.
golden round of receivers, right? Pitching your article from 2 days ago.
The golden range, man. I mean, there's just so many good guys there where, yeah, if I have a construction where I only have one running back through the first 4 rounds, and I'm kind of scared and don't want to go into 0 RB because I don't usually do that, then I do think he's a solid pick. But yeah, I feel like he's kind of because of the lack of upside and because people don't see him as a very, quote unquote, sexy pick. That's kind of why he gets the rap that he does.
Yeah, I actually think that Najee Harris, like a poor man's Najee Harris, makes a lot of sense to me. One, because he's another player whose advanced metrics look better than his traditional metrics, especially the broken tackle rate. I think he's been top 10 each of the last 2 years in that by percentage. But it's just the offense is bad. And that's why the numbers are bad and the efficiency is going to be bad because of the offense. So, I mean, a lot of this is a pitch that maybe Justin Fields can improve dramatically in year 2. I think that's what would open the potential for double-digit touchdowns for him. I don't necessarily think that's likely, but I think that Fields will be a lot better than his overall numbers showed last year. Even his splits last year showed that he improved dramatically in his second half of start. So I think I'm still pretty optimistic there. But speaking of optimism, go ahead, please.
Well, I was going to say, I don't think it's possible for Fields to even be close to. He couldn't be bad than the bottom last year. He was so horrendous last year. I don't think it's possible that he doesn't improve. But I did have a quick question for you. If you took Najee Harris and popped him into Chicago's offense, where do you think he'd have more success, in Pittsburgh or in Chicago, with both those teams not being great?
I think I'm going to say Pittsburgh. Their defense is dramatically better too, and I don't really know how much that kind of plays into it, but I would be a bit worried about Fields potentially taking some short yardage work away, and maybe sniping 3 or 4 touchdowns that could have been Montgomery's, which I don't really have that same concerns for. I assume Kenny Pickett for most of the year for the Steelers. But to me, it's not a totally dissimilar situation. So, like, I still wouldn't be stunned if Montgomery had 55 or 60 catches this season, even if that's a bit of an uptick from last year.
Yeah, and then we also have to assume, I mean, of course, we're just playing the what-if game, but if you had Montgomery on a good offense, right? If he was on, the Bills or the Rams or something like that, he probably would have a round or 2 ADP higher.
Completely agree. I think people would recognize it. And I don't know if it's just the offense. Maybe if he had a sexier name, I feel like maybe he should kind of workshop that a little bit. David Montgomery sounds like it could just be like any old fantasy football writer. We need a little bit more spice from you there, David. I think that's the key.
Yep, that makes sense.
Speaking of sexy names, Travis Etienne, clearly one of your favorite guys this season. I was actually wondering on Twitter yesterday, you were talking about who is the player that you have rostered on most of your leagues. I was wondering if it was maybe Etienne, because you have him ranked 14th among running backs. I'm way down at 25th, and I recognize that I'm way lower than everybody else. But what's the positive spin for Etienne in your mind?
The funny thing is, I'm actually, I don't want to say ambivalent, but I'm concerned. I do not like him as much as some of the high stakes guys in NFFC. They're scooping him up in the second round, end of the second. So, 20 to 24, sometimes early third. And I'm usually grabbing him if he falls to the third. So it's one of those things where I'm not jumping him. And I know that they are pricing him a little bit higher than the market, because if you go to your standard Yahoo CBS leagues, you can usually grab him in the 4th, sometimes even the 5th, which I think is fantastic. I feel like you would probably take that deal as well. But I think there's concern with obviously coming off the list, Frank, and it's been a year and all. But I think there's some stuff out there. I don't know how much you take stock into it, but the relation of the way that he runs to possible future re-injury. Have you seen anything on that?
I haven't seen enough where I would be convinced either way. It's just not really an area of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Like, honestly, my pessimism is more about James Robinson.
Yeah.
And I grant you that Robinson is not the talent that Etienne is, but Robinson is big. And he's averaged 5.0 and 4.8 yards per attempt on inside carries the last 2 seasons. And like in my mind, what if Travis Etienne comes in and is more of a Reggie Bush, where it's like you're getting a lot of work in the receiving game, which in a PPR format, which we're talking about that as from a rankings perspective, that is super valuable. But like, unless he's going to break away and score maybe 4 or 5 touchdowns from more than 20 yards from the end zone, like what is his touchdown upside realistically? I'm actually a huge Trevor Lawrence fan, somebody that I'm really high on. We could have discussed him probably, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, what if he ends up throwing a lot more of those touchdowns in close? And then what if Robinson's kind of the battering ram in close? Like, what does that leave for Etienne to make the case that he should be a second or third round draft pick? That's more my concern.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, and that's something that I was going to bring up as well. It is the James Robinson factor because he is good. He has proven that he is good, and he is the battering ram. So it's really the bet on ATN is for Robinson maybe to get off to a slow start, not be fully healthy, and ATN to just be kind of jamming like he has been all this time in camp. But also, it's from the receiving volume potential here because you're looking at theoretically possibly their wide receiver one. I mean, obviously Christian Kirk is the wide receiver one, and he's fantastic, but he's not like that. He's not Travis Etienne, right?
Yeah.
The guy that can do everything. So we'll see. Again, I think 80 where he's going in the higher stakes contest is definitely. I think it's a little bit of a push, right? You're really kind of hoping for the high end assumption. It's similar to Javonte Williams. There are a lot of people that won't touch Javonte Williams at 20 to 24 overall because Melvin Gordon is getting mixed in. But yes, any sort of injury to Gordon or to James Robinson would obviously help those guys, but that's not something we can bet on. So it's a tough spot for sure.
I wonder if that maybe is baked into Etienne because Robinson is coming off it was a torn ACL right last December, so
Mm-hmm.
it's like it's an aggressive recovery to be ready for week 1. So maybe that's where a lot of the optimism is coming from. But I don't know. Robinson came off the preseason PUP list 2 weeks ago, so I don't even think week 1 is necessarily out of the question. That's one of the reasons that I'm scared away, I guess, from a public perspective.
And I was going to say, I mean, really a lot of my projections, for example, are coming from the receiving work, and it's the fact that I think he can catch 75 plus balls. I mean, I've seen very bullish projections in the 90s plus, but he is a guy that I don't have for over 1,000 rushing yards. I think that would be the toughest of all the targets to hit. So there are many ways for him to not get there. That I agree.
All right, speaking of receivers, let's pivot over to wide receivers, where I am still really pushing for Keenan Allen, have him in the top 10 at 7th overall at the position. You're down at 16th, which I think is probably more standard. And to me, this is a case of like, I'm not really sure what's changed for Allen. Still has Herbert, one of the best quarterbacks in the league, which I think most people are on board with, and has 9.9 targets per game since 2019. That's the third highest among wide receivers behind just Devontae Adams and Michael Thomas. Again, talking about PPR formats, not a big touchdown scorer, but a big catcher of the football. He is 30 years old, but I would just say that from an efficiency standpoint, I think he's as good as ever. Last year, he had a 74.2% man success rate on his routes per reception perception. Matt Harmon's work, which I really am a big fan of, that's 14th best among charted wide receivers. I like looking at those man route success numbers because to me, that suggests that you can still kind of beat your man and you're not just relying on the slot getting those zone coverages and it's not really an abilities type thing. I think he's still got it. Something that I'll use to argue in favor of some of your preferred players coming up as well. But what are your thoughts on Allen? Why are you a little bit lower than me?
Yeah, I think I'm just right about where the market is, maybe just a touch below, and it has to do with all the talent in that range. So, obviously, don't get me wrong, I love Keenan Allen, I've been a huge fan, and I don't think he's 30 is old for a receiver,
I
especially
hope
the
not.
type.
Not even saying
Yeah,
my age. We're hoping not.
and the type of numbers he's been putting up, right? I mean, literally the most consistent wide receiver over the last half decade. Just look at his average line over the last 5 years: 150 targets, 102 catches, almost 1,200 yards, and 6.5 touchdowns. It's just just kind of falls again under that boring category because you haven't had a season from him of more than 8 touchdowns. And the fact that he's a low ADOT guy, just 8.5 last season, which was about 30th percentile. And yeah, I mean, and just the fact that it's just kind of a crowded group there, because you do have a very explosive Mike Williams, who might be even trusted even more so by Herbert this year, could have a little slightly higher target share. And then, of course, Austin Eckler, who was very active in the pass game as well. 94 targets with Herbert last year, 108 in his previous season. Of course, that was pre-Justin. And, I don't know. I don't know if I necessarily see much of a target regression there with Eckler. And then this is just being petty, but Keenan Allen was pretty quiet in the fantasy playoffs. I think that doesn't really mean much, but it just means there's one ball and a lot of great players there. So I think he's fine. I think he's worth absolutely a third round pick, but I've been seeing him go at the back of the second round at some points where I usually don't necessarily feel comfortable. And then even in the other case could be where you have guys like Terry McLaurin, and you may or may not like some of these guys, but guys that are sort of the standouts on their team, likely target hogs, like Terry McLaurin, Darnell Mooney, Deontay Johnson, and even Rashad Bateman. In some cases, those guys go a round or two later, even three, and may put up somewhat similar numbers to Keenan. But overall, I like him. I have no complaints.
All right, well, let's stick with Los Angeles with a player you have one spot ahead of Allen, and I have significantly behind, is Allen Robinson. Now with the Rams, you're the bullish ranker here, so why don't you pitch me? Why do you like Robinson so much?
Okay, so what I don't want to do is the fact that he burned me last year be a reason for me to feel that he owes me this year. So
Sure.
I do kind of want to throw last season, sort of in way back in the mind, and just remember that he was on a team he clearly didn't want to be on. He wasn't motivated, and I think that might even have something to do with some of the poor, the downgrade in some of the stats. The separation stats were bad, and you could almost feel it. There was just something off with him all year. This season, he's going to play with the best quarterback he's ever had in his life. I know people have heard that a million times, but the rapport with Matthew Stafford in camp so far has been electric. He's a big guy, 6'2", 210. I think we've already seen a lot of targeting in the red zone. And I think, he had that big season in, I think it was 2015, where he tied, I believe it was Tyreek Hill for the receiving touchdowns lead. They had 14 that season. And I think we might see double-digit touchdowns for the first time in those 7 years. And then if you just remove last year, we're not removing it, but just forget about last year. The two previous seasons, he had averaged 100 receptions with 1,200 yards between 2019 and 2020. So I think there's something here. My only concern is that now he's such a popular, sexy pick that he's getting pushed up to a tough spot. So I liked him when he wasn't as sexy and he was going in the fourth round. Now he's going in the third, a little bit tougher to stomach, but I think he's a pretty solid wide receiver too.
Well, the part of the argument that you made that I agree with for sure is that I don't think Robinson's cooked. And so you mentioned that some of his numbers weren't good. Like his overall fantasy numbers are horrible, 410 yards, 1 touchdown last year. But his man success percentage rate, the one that I mentioned previously from reception perception, 75%, still 12th best among charted wide receivers. And I would just say that they had major quarterback problems with the Bears last season. So to me, in my mind, he was open a lot and wasn't getting the catchable targets that you would need to actually translate that. Clearly, that's going to be a lot better with Stafford this year and with Sean McVay this season. But the reason that I'm still relatively lower in 26th, I think it's not really that much lower than he's going overall. I would just say that like Odell Beckham last year averaged 12.0 PPR points per game from weeks 12 to the end of the season. So that's after he joined the Rams and got to a pretty much 90% snap share going forward. Did score tons of touchdowns in that time as well, but he was 28th among wide receivers. And maybe you would point to Cooper Kupp having just like an unrepeatably excellent season, but it's hard for me to imagine that Robinson comes in and is the first option for Stafford. And that's why I'm a little bit lower on him than some of the other guys. Do you see that at all? Or you just think that this is like a touchdown upside case, kind of like maybe what Mike Williams was relative to Keenan Allen last year, in fact?
Yeah, I think that's a very good comp, and the fact that I mean, yeah, you have outside of those two. I mean, who do you really have in that receiver group, right? Because Van Jefferson is off to an unhealthy start and probably won't be there in week one. And
Yeah.
who else is there really to Atwell? So I think it's going to be a truncated target tree. Very, very. Darrell Henderson will be involved. I'm sure Cam Akers will catch some passes. Tyler Higbee is only now getting up to speed. He's a little behind, so I'd like to see him get off to a nice and hot start. I don't know if the Rams are going to have quite the success they saw last year. I think expecting some regression would be obvious, but I would love to see Allen Robinson step up into a role. I think I think he's better than Beckham. And say Beckham didn't get hurt like at this stage in their careers, slightly, right? I mean, I think they're both really really good, but I just have a feeling that and maybe it's just a hangover carryover from last year and getting burned. Some of that sometimes plays bakes into our psyche and we can't let it affect us. But there's just something that I feel about a nice connection with him and Stafford this season.
So you're not a Tutu Atwell guy? I mean, come on, this is the breakout.
You know what? 18th round in some best ball stacks when I have a Stafford and one of Kupp and Robinson. Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's great. All right. Sticking with the touchdown scores, I can't quit DK Metcalf. I still have him 18th. I know he doesn't have Russell Wilson. You have him way down at 31st, which again, I think probably maybe more aligns with the public perception here. But for my mind is that Metcalf is a proven touchdown scorer. He's huge, right? He's 6'4" and I don't know, what is he, like 235 pounds?
Mm-hmm.
Since 2018, he's got 6.7 expected touchdowns per 100 targets. That's just kind of telling you what areas of the field he's seeing those targets. And that's the third best among wide receivers behind Mike Williams and Mike Evans. And the point that I would say is that he lost Russell Wilson, yes, but last year he barely had Russell Wilson anyway. So Wilson was hurt for 5 weeks or so, came back too early. His finger wasn't right. And overall, Metcalf saw a 68% catchable target rate that was tied for the worst among wide receivers with 100 or more targets. And he still finished 21st in PPR points per game last season. So I'm like, I know Locke and Geno Smith aren't good, but the quarterback play that he saw last year, coincidentally, wasn't good either. And so I'm just not really sure what the big step back is going to be for Metcalf this season. I have him stepping back, but I still think he's a top 20 guy. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think the public perception is somewhere in between our rankings. You're 18 and my 31, so I think he's mostly there in the mid 20s. But it really depends what format you're playing and you're looking at him at.
Yeah.
Because on NFFC he's going in the 40s, so that's what, end of third, beginning of fourth, or no, in the fourth. And in Underdog, for example, the best balls you can get him in the 50s or 60s. So definitely different price points there. And I have no issues with him, obviously, from a talent standpoint. He was a big guy for me a couple of years ago when he was I believe, wide receiver 7 or 8. When
right.
Wilson supported 2 wide receiver ones that year. So, and Russell Wilson's one of my favorite fantasy targets over the years. So I love DK Metcalf. That's why it's kind of tough for me to kind of separate that from what my expectations are this year. But yeah, the stakes have changed a little bit. I think it is a really big deal. That having that hodgepodge of Geno Smith and Drew Lock there, where there's a clear drop off in talent, but you did sell a good point that really makes sense to me. Thinking back to how he was with Geno last year when Wilson was out, that makes sense. I'm probably a little lower than Metcalf than I should be, but yeah, I mean, he had those quiet box scores a few times last season where someone might think, oh, maybe he's just kind of like better in a best ball type scenario, where you don't want to get those stinkers and
yeah.
So it's tough. I like to put it like this. I like the player, but I kind of hate the price when he's going in the fourth round there.
Understandable. All right, one more wide receiver to hit before we close with a couple of tight ends. The receiver is Amari Cooper. And this is one where you can maybe talk me into this a little bit. I have him 22nd. I didn't lower him very much at all when he lost Watson for the 11 weeks instead of the 5. You have him way down at 38th, so pretty big gap there. I just can't help but stare at him relative to the surrounding talent that exists on this Browns team. Cooper has 517 career catches, which is a lot, and he's still just like 27 or 28. But everybody else on their team, not including the running backs, has 388 combined in their careers. We're talking Donovan Peoples-Jones, Anthony Schwartz, Jakeem Grant, who may be hurt, I can't remember, Javon Wims, Jamarcus Bradley, David Bell, Michael Woods is a rookie. So is David Bell, David Njoku and Harrison Bryant. Austin Hooper's not with the team anymore. It's just like there is nothing here next to Cooper at wide receiver. And so Jacoby Brissett maybe isn't going to be able to support multiple receivers from a fantasy sense, but can he stare at Cooper a lot and throw him the ball? I think maybe the answer is yes, but why do you think differently?
And the funny part is, I don't necessarily think differently because I have a lot of Amari shares. And a lot of it has to do with, again, falling under the, oh, he's boring or he doesn't have a good quarterback. People are overlooking the fact that he's probably going to be a target hog. So I'm actually fine with him and I have a lot of shares, but he's just really kind of unpopular in drafts. And he's always falling to a place where I can get him as my fourth.
Yeah,
And people are sometimes shooting for the upside of a Sky Moore or a Treylon Burks, and I'd rather have Amari in those spots.
for sure.
And I've been a huge proponent of his for years. I've also been caught with my fantasy pants down, so to speak, taking him way earlier than I should have in his bad years when he got hurt. But I do think he's phenomenally talented. It is a run-heavy offense, obviously running through Chubb and Hunt. That said, you nailed it on the head. The wide receivers on this team, like, man, like I love Donovan Peoples-Jones as a runner, right? But you're not getting fantasy points if you're running back and forth down the field. Same with Anthony Schwartz, possibly the fastest receiver in the league, but the hands you're not so sure about. So who's Jacoby going to trust and lock in on? It's going to be Amari. So I can see 85 plus catches. I think is maybe yards per reception, maybe stays in the same range it's been. Like I think earlier in his career he was with Oakland last year in Oakland, and then in Dallas he was like 14 to 15 per reception, and now he's like been 11, 12. So I think it really depends on that. Can Jacoby get him some medium size, medium throws, long balls? So we'll see. I like Amari Cooper more than the field, and I'm going to have to reassess where I have him here. If I have him 38th, that means something might be wrong with my rankings.
Okay, good. Well, then I convinced you on a player, so to
Yep.
speak. All right, 2 tight ends, and then we'll be done with this. Robert Tonyan, who I have at 12th and you have at 21st. I think I'm maybe unreasonably high here because we're not sure if Tonyan's going to be ready for week 1, but I just can't get away from the fact that the Packers lost Devontae Adams. They're searching for a number 1 option at receiver. And Tonyan, when we last saw him, was really, really productive and effective from a fantasy perspective. 2.6 fantasy points per target since 2020. That's the most among tight ends with 50 or more targets. And he came off the PUP list a couple of weeks ago. Again, that's the preseason one. So we still don't really know if week 1 is in the cards, but it's trending as maybe he's not going to land on the real PUP list, which would prevent him from playing in the first 4 weeks. So I'm optimistic from that sense and think that Tonyan could really be a featured part of the Packers offense. Do you think there's a chance that could happen?
Absolutely. It really just, I think, comes down to his health. Again, like you mentioned, not 100% certain he'll be ready to start week 1. My one big concern right now is the whispers of the Mike Gesicki rumors to Green Bay. And obviously, I think something like that would hurt Tanyan's value considerably. But I don't know if there are any truth to the rumors. Maybe that means they're concerned about his health despite taking him off PUP. I really don't know if those rumors have any legs. So,
well, you know the joke that I'm going to make, which is that Gesicki would be a great number 2 wide receiver because he never
yep,
runs any routes from a traditional tight end spot on the field. I'd
yep,
love to see both of them on the field. That would be amazing. But
yep.
I can't argue with you that Tonyan would be hurt just the same way that Alan Lazard would be hurt if they added Gesicki, who seems like it would be a great fit. I want to get Gesicki out of the Dolphins because I just feel like he's a field stretcher, and that's not really the right fit for the wide zone offense there. But intriguing, but until I hear that confirmed, I'm going to say that Tonyan's a really, really nice sleeper this year for fantasy.
Yeah, and then obviously that monster season with the red zone dominance that you had alluded to, but he scored 11 touchdowns that season.
Which was
Seven.
lucky.
And seven on 11 red zone targets, and then you kind of had that natural regression in the 8 games that he played the following season, last season, just 1 red zone touchdown. But the targets were there. He was on pace for the same thing. So I'm okay with him. I haven't been landing a lot on him. It's weird to be underexposed on Green Bay players, considering all the fantasy success we've had from them over the years.
But it makes sense in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So you're big, I think, tight end to push here is within the division. It's Cole Kmet. You have him in the top 10 at 9th at the position, which granted, there's not really 9 good tight ends. So we're kind of splitting hairs a little bit, but I have him 15th. I thought I was going to be kind of optimistic there, but clearly not as much as you. So why don't you talk me through why you have Kmet as high as you do?
I think part of it has to do with me plugging in numbers and doing projections before I'm trying to rank them, right? Because I feel like if you're ranking and then trying to make the numbers, you're trying to adjust them to your ranking, and it doesn't come off naturally. So, but for me here, it just comes down to a couple of main things. It's the lack of target competition on this team. You essentially have Darnell Mooney, you have David Montgomery, and then also expected regression from a guy who scored 0 touchdowns last year, despite seeing
Correct.
60, catching 60 balls and 93 targets. He had a 17.5% target share. I think he can be above 20% this year. And he actually saw 14 red zone targets last year. I think we could see 20 plus, maybe, convert some of those. So, and as we talked about before, can't imagine Justin Fields being any possibly worse. So I do like him. I like Freiermuth in this range as well. So I like those guys, but really comes down to those touchdowns. That's going to be the difference maker on whether he's a top 10 guy or not. We're probably in the same ballpark with receptions, right? Maybe 50 to 65 with like 650 yards, somewhere to 800 yards. But it's the touchdowns, right? Whether he scores 2 or 8 or somewhere in between is going to be what determines his value.
And I can support that with some stats as well. You mentioned that the competition is lesser. Jimmy Graham's not here anymore. That's 3 touchdowns and 3 expected touchdowns off the board. And the Kmet last year had 3.8 expected touchdowns. Not a surprising number when you hear how many red zone and end zone targets, like you mentioned, that he got. But given that he didn't actually score, he ended up with the biggest touchdown shortfall next to his expected total for the season. So I think I would be pretty stunned if he didn't score at least 4 times this year. I'm eyeing maybe 5 or 6, which I think that is what gives him the real chance to be a top 10 option in the position this season.
And I remember it so well last year because I was waiting. I think I had him on a couple teams waiting for a touchdown. And I just remember seeing someone catch the ball, a big guy catch the ball, like in the corner of my eye. I was like, yes, finally. Oh no, it's Jimmy Graham, or no, it's whoever one of the other guys were there.
Absolutely. Well, Vlad, it was such a pleasure to have you on and actually talk to you in audio format for the first time. A lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining. Tell everybody what you have going on. Obviously, great work at FTN Fantasy, but is there anything in particular that you want to point out?
No, I want to thank you so much for having me on. A pleasure, definitely mine as well, to be able to chat with you and one of the sharpest minds before I even before you even joined the company. Just kind of following your work beforehand. So it's nice to talk to you and great to have you on the team. But follow me on Twitter at RotoGut, and just going to be working on in this season a high stakes column for free agent bidding. So people looking to sort of figure out how to spend their fab budgets. I'll be covering that during the year. And then this preseason, I'm just doing weekly strategy articles, draft, roster construction, things like that. So thanks again for having me.
Absolutely. Check him out on Twitter at RotoGut, as you mentioned, at FTN Fantasy. Vlad, can't wait to have you on again. Hope you have great drafts along with all of our fans this weekend. Thanks again to Vlad for joining me on this episode, and thank you for sticking with us until the end. Please do me a favor and follow me on Twitter at Scott_Spratt, and please subscribe to the Advanced Stats with Scott Spratt podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and give me a 5-star review. That really helps other people discover the show. We really appreciate it, and good luck to you in your fantasy drafts this weekend. We'll be back next week with some new episodes.